club was formed on April 6th, 1866, and it lasted until 1973, when in November the property was sold to the state of New York. Well, this was very remote. When they first came to Connetquot's Tavern, it was only a 2-day journey by coach and stage. Connetquot's was a stagecoach stop. And then they had the railroad. The first railroad came out in 1840, and it was the main line branch that went through Central Islip onto Riverhead. And they would be picked up at the railroad station and come through the woods from Central Islip all the way down, cross at Bunce's Crossing, come down here, and they would offload their gear and they would stay for 2 or 3 days. Later on, in the 1870s, the South Shore branch started, and then they had Club Station, which was a whistle stop. It was just a building that was there with a few chairs and that sort of thing. And to be picked up, they would put a flag out, the train would stop. Of course, it probably should, because they all had shares of stock in the railroad. This is the locker room of the old South Side Sportsman's Club. This portion of the building was constructed in 1887, 1888, added to Connetquot's Tavern. And here we have the lockers. It's where people kept their shooting and fishing gear. We have one set up showing the locker of Mr. S.K. Farrington, Selwyn Kip Farrington, who was very, very avid fisherman and shooter and railroad man, and also a deep sea fisherman. Lots of nice people had their lockers. Mr. Witter, Dean Witter, had it. General C.R. Smith, John McCloy, Colonel Stempson, who was Secretary of War. So you had all of these people that were in this room, and they came out here to relax, and they liked it here. They liked this property. They enjoyed it, and they kept it going. And it was a full-service club, too, in that you had breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Everything that you'd need if you wanted to get away from the cares and troubles of New York City. And they came out here and they would go fishing in the evening on Friday if they came on the early train, or on late train they'd come in and sit in the billiard room, read the paper, have dinner, and then go fishing the next morning, have lunch, and be around, go for a walk, do whatever activity they liked in the country. They'd sit and have conversations talking about fishing, shooting, that sort of thing. And during shooting season, they would come out, but they had pretty strict rules at that time too, because during the duck season, no guests were allowed, no women were allowed. They just came out for the duck shooting, and they would have dinner on Friday night. They would draw for their choice of blinds, and there would be a great deal of camaraderie about who got what blind and where they would go. And then they would sit and chat and go to bed and get up in the early morning to go out at 7 o'clock in the morning and go shooting, and then come back and have lunch. Some go back to town. Some would just stay here and enjoy the property. And then we would have pheasant shooting the same way. They would come out from town, and the pheasant shoots would be held on Saturday morning at 10 o'clock. And everyone would be ready to go at that time, because we tried to have a rule: if you weren't there, it started anyway. There were only a few people who tried to abuse that, and they found that it started without them. As Mr. Crocker would say, Mr. Crocker was chairman of the board of the Columbia gas system. He told me very early on that he had a rule in his company: either be on time or not at all. So that's what we tried to stick to. So that's the way the shooting went. Here we are in the kitchen, and people have asked, What was the kitchen like? The kitchen was the most active spot because during the shooting season, breakfast would be at 5:30. Members would dine at about 6 and then go out at 7 o'clock. But the guides would have to be fed, and so the staff would be here. This flat top would be humming right along. Vulcan stove, great stove to cook on, and so you would have breakfast ready for them, and then they'd have to have lunch ready, and then dinner ready. You had all sorts of good food, and we tried to use the local foods. Lots of fish for the opening duck dinner and the opening fish dinner. We would have baked whiting as the first course, and then usually roast beef. And during the fishing season, many of the members went fishing in Canada. You would have salmon for lunch, or salmon for dinner, or the local products from the bay. Flounder, bass, weakfish. But the kitchen was always a very active spot because you had, the staff was here, the guides would come in during the shooting season. If people had a picnic, they would take a guide with them, such as Frank, who would take a frying pan with him, and they'd got some breakfast trout, little 6-7 inch fish, and he'd fry them up in the pan with lots of good caloric things like butter and what have you. So they would catch their fish and eat them. Members would come here and do the outdoor activities they wanted, and they'd come back in and have a nice luncheon. Because many came here with their wives, and they'd come back and have luncheon with their wives, and then go for a walk or whatever they would like to do. Some would take a nap in the afternoon. You have to remember, when you're a kid of 15 or so, all the members were pretty old. I mean, some of them were in their 40s and their 50s. And to a 15-year-old, that looks like antiquity. But many of them were even older. Mr. Pomeroy, when I first met him, was in his 80s, and he lived to be 96. Mr. John M.P. Thatcher was here. He lived to be well in his 80s. Count Villa lived to be 89. But these were all active people, and they kept going. Mr. Robert Winthrop lived to be 96. So there was something to be said for the out of doors, that it kept you going. The billiard room was used as a member's room. The Franklin stove that came from the old Astor House in New York is there, and it was just a very comfortable room with the rockers that were there. The members would come in and sit in the rockers in front of the fire. It happened to be a cool evening or a cool afternoon. There would be a fire going for them. We always had fresh fruit in there if they wanted to have a snack of some sort. You have to remember, the club was limited to 100 members, so it was never crowded. But there was activity for the members every month of the year. This is the main dining room. It was the men's room, men's dining room. Ladies were not allowed in this room except for New Year's, and they could join the party on New Year's Eve and have dinner in the men's dining room. And they were also allowed into the billiard room on New Year's Eve, and that was the only time that they were allowed. The rest of the time, they had the ladies' half of the club, with the ladies' sitting room and all. So that it was just a very nice room, and it was a very nice room whether you were dining alone or if there were 20 or 30 people here. People have asked me how I got started here. It's because I grew up on the Westbrook Estate, which was the adjacent property purchased by Mr. Cutting, who was a member here. And he built his house in 1886. and my dad was the herdsman there. And it was wartime, so I started working when I was 14 in the cow barn, milking cows, feeding them, doing that, going to school. And I thought there perhaps had to be a better way. So I would sneak over here to the club to watch the old gentlemen fishing from the highway. And then I got brave and I came in and I went over and I looked at the kennels and the dogs barked at me and I thought, oh, I'm in trouble now. But I knew some of the guides. I knew Ray Garrett and Eddie Zucklin and people that were there working for the club. And then I would guide some of the old gentlemen fishing starting in 1945. Mr. Litchfield, he's a very, very nice man. Several of the other members would have me to go out and net their fish for them and clean them, put them in a basket ready to go to New York or wrap them in a package. And that's how I started. In talking about shooting, the first tower shoots they had were in the tower lot, which was in the 1920s. There was a fire tower down along the west line, and they used to fly guinea hens from that, and that was not very successful. And so that was about the only attempt they made at that. Prior to that, they had tried quail shooting. They were going to make this the Okatee of the North, and they put in little clearings. There are actually about 50 of them that you can find. We used to call it the quail patch game to find all these quail patches. They were just little patches. They imported birds. They put them out, but they had problems with deer. They had to fence them off, and it was never very successful. So then after the war, in October of 1947, they decided to have a pheasant shoot. And so they set up a course for a tower shoot along the Hatchery Road, just a short walk here from the clubhouse. And they started. The very first day it poured rain. But they were tough and they kept going. And then they had several pheasant shoots that year, and each year the shoots would start in October. They would take a holiday for the duck season, with the exception of Thanksgiving and New Year's, when they would also have a pheasant shoot, and then continue into February with walk-ups lasting until the end of February. Later on, the season was extended through the end of March for walk-ups, and that was done. But that's how that got started, and it always worked out very well. And we always had lots of help for the shoots and for the fishing and all. We always liked to hire new people. I had the good fortune to take over the operation in 1960, and there was a nice young kid that was recommended to come here and be a guide and that sort of thing. And since I went to school with his mother, I said, well, we'd try it. And he came to work for the Connetquot River Club, which was formed after 1963 when the property was sold. Craig was a very nice, bright young man who also had the same disease I have, which is he liked to be out of doors, and he liked to fish, and he liked to shoot.
Well, as a young boy growing up in East Islip and then Oakdale from 1955 on, like anyone interested in the outdoors, we were always infatuated by what was behind the fences and the gates of the famous South Side Sportsman's Club. And so in the early days, while I used to fish Bubbles Falls and try to cast underneath Sunrise Highway, finally in 1964, my mom, who had gone to school with Gilbert, was able to get me the opportunity to talk to Gil and introduce myself, and I was fortunate to get a job here.
Like everybody else that worked here, do everything. Whatever you were told to do, you were to do. We multitasked everyone. You could be cleaning the kennels, you could be stocking fish, you could be transporting fish from one pond to the other. There are a multitude of jobs to do here, and we tried to have people well-versed in all of them.
Summertime, we had all kinds of tasks: mowing trails, taking care of the animals, raising ducks during the summertime, a lot of work with the fish at the hatchery, stocking the streams weekly. But my nearest and dearest opportunities here had to do with the hunting aspect of this club. I grew up as a hunter with my grandfather and my father. My father taught me waterfowling hunting, and really that was another intimate connection that I had here with the club, because I grew up down near the mouth of the Connetquot River, and every night at about 5 o'clock, thousands of waterfowl would leave here and fly down to the marshes in the bay at the mouth of the river. And I could stand in my backyard there every night and listen to the sound of whistling wings going overhead and the chatter of ducks up above the house, and knowing very well that they had spent their days here. So it was great when I finally got the opportunity to get behind those hallowed gates and get in here. There were two main areas where waterfowl concentrated. One was the main pond, right here behind the house, in front of the house, and the second one was about halfway up the property in what's called the deep water swamp. And these two areas provided tremendous refuge for the waterfowl on the property, and consequently they were sort of evenly distributed, you know, on a north and south line throughout the property. Come October, you'd see the first migrants start to come in, usually widgeon. You could hear them, very vocal birds out on the pond behind the kennels when I was working up there. Green-winged teal, of course, early migrants. But gradually, as the fall went on, and our seasons then were somewhat earlier. Generally, the waterfowl season started in early November. The numbers would build up on the main pond too. I'd have to estimate several thousand birds. I'd say 2,000 to 3,000 birds on the main pond. If you look out there now, you don't see anywhere near those numbers. So it's interesting to note that while this property was hunted, it provided tremendous sanctuary for waterfowl at that time when numbers were a lot more abundant on Long Island. And similarly, again, halfway up the property in Deepwater Swamp probably also housed another 1,000 to 2,000 birds in there, and rarely got to see those because it was sort of an area where it was very difficult to access. You knew they were in there, you'd see them go in, you'd see them come out, but it was pretty much off limits. Waterfowl hunting was truly done in a grand way here. The guides would meet their party in front of the house, be ready to go. Shooting started at 7 a.m. in the morning, ended at 11. Then there'd be a lunch break, and if they had a chance to draw for a second blind, they could go out in the afternoon from 1 to 4 and be done. Canal blind was pretty productive area. It was interesting in that it didn't involve big spreads of decoys or anything like that. We generally had 4 to 6 wildfowler decoys, old representatives of old world decoys that were quality birds, and generally pretty productive. Now, interestingly enough, back then the limits rather were actually more restrictive than they are now. In the 60s, when I was here, waterfowl numbers were down continentally, and I think the bag limit was probably 4 at that time, although maybe only 3. And so when you would come in with your party, you'd come in and register what they had shot, how many shells they had fired. There was a limit on how many shells they could use, what species had been bagged, which could have typically been either black duck, mallard, perhaps wood duck, green-winged teal, an occasional gadwall or widgeon. And from there, they'd be tagged with the gunner's name on it, and into the ice house they would go and be stored there. And so when I wasn't out guiding, it was always great to run up here during the week, as soon as I got home from school, and look in the ice house and see what was hanging down there. Because in the old English way of treating game, you did not have to clean them immediately after shooting. So the birds would hang in the ice house and be cooled and chilled for perhaps even a week. So you'd have all the tags down there of who shot what and what day and everything. Always an interesting adventure to look in the ice house. The other means of shooting that I did participate with here were the tower shoots, which were basically organized social events surrounding a pheasant release, which consisted of 12 stations, sort of in a clock scenario around the release point. And those, all of The guides would have their retrievers with them, and we'd be positioned around the circle and pick up pheasants as they were shot during the release. That started at 10 in the morning, and there was always coffee and Danish served out in the field for the guns, and then they'd come back and have lunch, and there was a limited opportunity to go back out in the afternoon for those that wanted to and do what would be called a walk-up or a cleanup. And we hunted both sides of the road to look for birds that had escaped the release, and generally 2 or 3 guides would go on that, and I was usually involved in those almost every time, I think. And you'd shoot another 20 or 30 birds on a walk-up, go up property one side of the hatchery road, come across and come back down the other side. And that was done after the tower shoots, which were always held on a Saturday unless there was a private member shoot, which could have been any day of the week if he was buying the whole shoot. So those were sort of the 3 types of shooting that was conducted on the properties in the era that I was here. The wild duck shooting, the tower shoots, and the pheasant walk-ups.
Deer hunting in the 1800s was considered a gentleman's sport. They were allowed to do that, they enjoyed it, and the deer we have over the mantel was shot by Mr. Jones Rogers in 1867, and he had sent a letter to welcome R. Beebe, the secretary of the club, stating that, "I am sensibly pleased and gratified to know that you're going to have the deer head mounted and hung in the clubhouse. I do not claim to be a great shot, but I tell you, welcome, it was a great shot that killed that deer. I was at Hennessy's shooting ducks, and I had my central fire breech-loading shotgun that I got from Mr. Daw of Threadneedle Street, London. 2 blacks came in as if to light. I fired and killed them both, and I heard a rustle in the bushes, and a deer burst forth. I had put my hand in my greatcoat pocket, took out the deer shells, put it in, and fired a shot and killed the deer before it reached the far bank. I tell you, welcome, that the plethora of game that we now have will be threatened by the breech-loading central fire shotgun, and we have to do something about it." So that's how deer hunting went, and they did deer hunt until probably the 1890s or so, and at that time the deer population was quite far down, and during the time the club was, that I knew the club, the members never thought about hunting deer. They were, by then, duck hunters and pheasant hunters and fishermen. Fishing was the longest season, so they went fishing.
It's important to understand, even going back to folks like Theodore Roosevelt, who probably set foot on this property, that the earliest conservationists were hunters and fishermen. And they understood that in order to have populations of the game that they were going to pursue, whether it was fish, fowl, or bigger game, that you needed to have the landscape and the habitat to have those species. The property that we're sitting on today, almost 3,000 acres of protected landscape. And we could go right down the list. Across the road, the Bayard Cutting Arboretum, owned by Mr. Cutting, who was a member here. Heckscher State Park, who was owned by John G. Heckscher, who was a member here. It's part of the Sable landscape, owned by various people that were members here. All of these properties exist today as open recreational opportunities and historical opportunities for us to enjoy because they were in the hands of sportsmen. If it was in the hands of a developer or some other speculator, Lord only knows what this particular property would look like today.
I've been asked about changes. My best way to describe that is when I first made the transition from guide to club manager. Mr. Adensel, who was the president, gave me a little bit of advice, and that was, don't change anything. So that's what we tried to stick to, and that's what we still try to do, is to have a bit of this property, what it was like, what Long Island used to be like, what game was here, what wildlife was here, the birds and all that you can see, they're still here. And it has changed very little. It's still Long Island. And Long Island's one of the greatest islands in the world. And it was an even greater one before we developed it. And I think we have an obligation to keep something like that still available for those that enjoy being out and alone. Just yesterday I was talking to someone from the Geological Survey who was doing a check of the water flow at Bunce's. And he just said out of a clear sky, he said, you know, I love to come here. It's so quiet, it's so peaceful, it's so much better than being in the office. And I think that's always been true. The members have always felt that way.